Hello everyone, my name is Krzysztof Bińczak, I'm editor at GameMusic.net, and we're here today to talk about the process of music creation and development for video games. And to do so we've invited three great composers. Allow me to introduce them. First, Mr. Olivier Deriviere, the composer behind games like Alone in the Dark, recently Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, and Bound by Flame, and also Remember Me. Next, Marcin Przybyłowicz, who worked on music for The Witcher 2 and is now busy creating music for The Witcher 3, The Wild Hunt. And we have Piotr Musiał, who orchestrated Bulletstorm and also worked on the Anomaly series. All right, so we're about to talk about how the process of creating music has changed during the last 15 years. And we've chosen 1.5 decade, 15 years, because some significant changes happened back then. And just a quick reminder, what was the game industry, where were we in the video game industry in the last 15 years? You know, it was 1999, it was the advent of the 6th generation of consoles, you know, PlayStation 2 came out, I'm sure you remember those times. And that meant that the DVDs came to the video game industry. DVDs meant more space for video games, more space for the music as well, and the industry soon started booming into the online gameplay on consoles. So the first question goes to you, Oliver. You have the most experience here in this field, and when you think of those early projects of yours in the early 2000s, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Yes, hello, thank you for inviting me. What I had as a gamer and as a composer, I had two feelings. The first feeling was, wow, now we can have great quality in games because we have the CD track quality, so we can put anything like an orchestra or a band. But on the other hand, I was like, okay, so what we had before this era was that we have the flexibility because the music was not dead on a CD, it was reacting to a game. So at this time it was good for music production and kind of bad for music integration, interactivity actually.
Yeah, that's some point, you know, because those were the times when everything was beginning to shift, you know, and soon after, right out of nowhere, there are concerts being organized about video game music, and soundtracks are being put on CDs. And what do you guys think about those early 2000s? What was it back then? What has changed besides the bigger budgets?
Well, obviously, is the fact that you could have great quality into music in terms of production made people more interested into composing for games because it was not only the blip, blip, blip that you could have, but now you could have a real orchestra. So it was a good input and a good step up from the previous kind of style. But once again, I think that we had to be very careful that the music production is just one part of what music can be, but we're doing music for games. And what we'd like to do, I mean, at the time it was to improve the music production for video games, but, and we're going to talk about this, I'm pretty sure, later, you know, years later, meaning, you know, kind now, we are back to what we did prior to this area.
All right, Marcin, do you agree that the industry is going like in a big circle? You know, first we had those cheap tunes and now they're back in fashion? Or what do you think about that?
I think that's a really interesting point because what I see is also that music in video games started to also complement the complexity of the games. So the moment games became more complex in story-wise, in narration, music had to, you know, respond to that in order to create consistent piece of art, which video games are. So yeah, basically I would say that, you know, the art in all different segments is going in 4 circles. We have that in movies, we have that in music, in visual arts, and so in games, yeah.
All right, the point taken, right? And still, if we go back to the early 2000s, for example, you know, there's this behind-the-scenes kind of war in the game music industry between those who prefer to work only on samples and those who are always for, you know, creating this big orchestra, you know, and we can't make music if we don't record orchestra. And I know, Piotr, how can you relate to that? Do you think that samples get more hate than they deserve?
Yeah, maybe yes, because probably some composers wouldn't be able to compose without those samples. Well, for example, you know, there are times that you really can't imagine the sounds that well as do samples help you to imagine it. So for me, for example, the samples, of course, that started somewhere in the 90s, late 90s, maybe thanks to the first orchestral libraries like Peter Szydlaczek. That was one of those first ones. That's really opened. I think that's really opened the doors for many composers. I don't think it's a bad thing, really, and it's really progressing still.
Right, but using samples means lesser costs, right?
Yes, so a lot of composers would like to have their music performed, but for video games you don't want to go live only. It would be a mistake. Why? Because when you do a game, you don't know how the game production will go. And if you go, like, say, at this period of the production live, it means that your music will be just recorded the way it is. And if you need flexibility, if you need to change something because the game changed, you know, at some point from what it was prior to this time, then you can't change it because it's, you know, it's just passive music. It's dead. You can't remove what was recorded. Now with samples, what you can do is go back to your studio and change. So my guess is you have to work, when you work in video games, with both. If you can, you go live and you record the major themes, the major sequences that you want, but then you have to have some backup, some safety with the samples.
Do you guys agree on this, or do you prefer to work solely on samples, for example, or only on live orchestrations?
Well, I think the point is that sample libraries are another tool in our arsenal, and they just simply are helping with our work with, as Olivier said, when you work on a project, when you have enough budget to do session recordings later on in the production phase, usually you do things we call pilots. So basically these are MIDI or MP3 mock-ups of music that is going to be recorded. And by doing that, we can make sure that music we are coming up with will fit the game. Let's say that, for example, creative guys behind the game itself can also feel the game with the music, see how it's working out or not, and propose changes or another iteration. So I completely agree that this is just another tool for us, and I think it depends on the composer how this tool will be used.
Really, samples and orchestras do different things actually, and they kind of correlate to each other and complement themselves. So there are things that you can do with samples, huge sounds, really unrealistic big sounds. But it's difficult to do with well, modest orchestras, even if you have like 80 or 90 musicians. Sometimes it's a limitation, and some things are just more bound to sample style. You know, like big drums and this kind of stuff.
All right, so it's not like that it always comes right down to the money. Okay, so if you have the budget, then you should always go with a live orchestra. You shouldn't, right? That's what you guys are trying to say?
I mean, why do you want to go live orchestra when the game doesn't need this? It means that not every game needs to go with an orchestra. You can have electronic music, you know, but it's still the same. The more money you have, the better production you're gonna get, you know. So money is always an issue with music, and people believe that now, you know, they see us and they're like, oh, they can provide music from their home studio, which is right in a way. But if they want quality, if they want the best sound, we need to go out, because we're not professional engineers. We're not professional mixers. We don't know how to master, when somebody that is like professional in mastering would provide you with a much better sound. So budget matters for music, even if it's not an orchestra, I believe.
All right. Why I'm asking this is because there is this trend in the industry nowadays to do everything in the games like it's in the movies, right? Yeah. And that means bigger budgets, and that also means, you know, there's this connotation to orchestra always. So that's just an observation, you know. I'm not sure if you agree, if it's a good trend or if it's a bad trend, or...
I think we need to remember that music, at first place, needs to serve the game. We are not doing music that is supposed to be independent, all by itself, 100% independent and without any connections to the broader project. We are often composing illustrative music, music that serves storyline, that serves gameplay, narration, etc. So I think the answer to your question would be that whatever the project needs, to be honest. If, for example, someone is working on big, you know, blockbuster-like a game, let's say as big as Bulletstorm, for example, which needs to have this broad, aggressive, dynamic, epic sound, yeah, probably, you know, mixture of symphonic orchestra, choir, and some session recordings with session musicians would be the good choice. But let's say that when you work on some more intimate project, maybe that would be an adventure game. So maybe the scope of the music should be also, you know, more fitable to the project. Maybe just some piano music, maybe a string quartet, or maybe a jazz combo. It all depends on the project.
Can I add something? I mean, I agree on some part of what you're saying, but I believe that this trend you're talking about, meaning that, oh, Hans Zimmer, let's say him because he's the big guy, Hans Zimmer is doing this style of music, so we want the same style. It's a fashion. It's because people are like, wow, so it's on, I don't know, the Batman or lately Spider-Man 2, and they want to have this type of music on their own game because, one, it makes them feel they have, you know, a sort of a part of it, you know, into their own game. Two, there is a sort of, you know, there is no risk in doing this because they know that the fashion is that, and so going out of this fashion is a risk. So you have to consider this when you speak with a producer or a creative director, that he would speak to you as someone that has money, and he's like, he doesn't know what is, you know, something fresh and unique to his game unless you bring it to him, yet he knows it's going to be risky. So you have to convince him, and there is a process into this that, you know, worked for many games that I did, and that worked on other games that other composers did. But actually, in games, the trend, the fashion is to look at Hollywood and to be, oh, I'm going to do the same. It's a, you know, it's a situation we have.
Yeah, of course. I think that recently there's this trend towards more emotional music. So maybe that's my opinion. Maybe I don't listen to enough music from games, but generally I think it's going towards more emotional stuff, and this way the orchestra can do it slightly, but maybe even much better because of the kind of additional dimension it gives to the production. Just talking about music itself, not the way it works in the game.
I disagree. Sorry. No, I don't think orchestra can be emotional more than electronic music. I think electronic music can be very emotional. The only thing is, you know, it depends the way you write it and the way it's implemented and the way it's used in the game. Same for the movie. I mean, sometimes you watch a movie with Cliff Martinez music, which is only electronic, and sometimes it's very emotional, you know, very engaging. Whether when sometimes the orchestra is very big and strong and there is no emotion, there is just a wall of sound like, you know. So I understand your point, and you're right saying that with orchestra you can go very emotional, but it doesn't mean that without an orchestra you can't. This is something, you know, and I have to, as well, you know, tell this to people because they think that only an orchestra can do this, but you know, it's wrong in my opinion.
Yeah, the point was the additional dimension to the music, because of course sometimes the orchestra can be tired and completely indifferent to the music when they record it, but there is a huge difference, well, at least philosophically, when writing music yourself and performing it yourself, it's just yourself there. And when there's like 80 musicians, then there's kind of something more than that.
Yeah, Oliver, you at one moment you said that it's a fashion, right? So I assume it's temporary, but do you think that it's gonna switch at some point? You know that Hollywood filmmakers are gonna start to hire video game composers to make music specifically for movies?
Hopefully yes, but I'm pretty sure it won't happen soon. No, I think that the fashion to hire those guys is just because they have the budget and they want the names. It's not about the music itself, you know, more than this. Yet what I believe is the fashion will, you know, it's a cycle, and we are here, you know, with the John Williams era in the 80s and all this very melodic, thematic music, orchestral music, and then, you know, mid 90s we had Hans Zimmer coming in with the big sound, big brass, like rock band. So now it's getting a little bit like overused, and people are starting to be kind of irritating by this trend. The only thing is I can't tell you when it's going to happen and who's going to bring this. You know, hopefully it's one of us, maybe. But obviously it's going to end, you know, at some point, which is a good news for everybody.
Do you guys agree with that? That, you know, it's just a fashion and it's going to end? Or is it like the final stage of the evolution or something?
Yeah, regarding Hans Zimmer kind of music and huge and over the top, I hope so.
All right.
But the question is, how far can you go until you reach the end of the line? So, for example, I went recently to the cinema and I saw the amazing Spider-Man 2. I knew that Hans Zimmer was composing score for that movie, and I thought I knew what I was expecting from the music, that it's gonna have this particular Hans Zimmerish sound, particular approach to melodies, to chord progressions, etc. And actually I was blown away, because that was the first time in a while that I discovered that this line can be pushed even more forward. That was the first time I heard proper use that actually I liked, use of mixture of dubstep music and symphonic score. So I wasn't expecting that. I thought that this is the end of the line. After the inception, there's nothing that will go, you know, broader, more powerful and more epic. No, I was wrong, actually.
All right, that's one way to put it, right? But Hollywood aside, I think we may be observing some new trend lately. For example, you guys surely know that Paul McCartney, the Beatle, has been hired to do some music on Destiny, the new sort of follow-up to Halo. And what do you guys think about it? That it's, you know, just a temporary one hit, or?
In my opinion, it could be very great if Paul McCartney would know the game and would know how games work and would know how, you know, if he would be a gamer and understand the gaming. Because right now we're talking about music only and we're forgetting what it is for, meaning a game. And I believe that, you know, you can hire the best composer and have a great music. You know, it doesn't mean that the music on the game would be bad or anything. But I believe that if you get someone that knows how a game works, how a game is made, and how music can, you know, enhance the player's experience by using a lot of tricks that we have now, thanks to the technology that, you know, back in the days we didn't have, and now we have it, the flexibility of doing anything we want with the music depending on the game. Well, if you have a composer that know about this and that can exploit this system, then you're going to get a greater experience for the game. So to have Paul McCartney may be a great asset to the game if he's a gamer, you know, I believe. I'm pretty sure he's not, you know, but you know, this is what I would like to get. It's like new names because they know what they're doing, you know.
Yeah, I'd like you, Marcin, to relate to that because we know that you're recording some music together with a band, you know, and so maybe you've got some experience on how it is to work on a game score with someone who does music on their own, you know, commercially.
Yeah, I think that. Well, the first thing is that the question is what would be Paul McCartney's involvement in the game. So whether he would write only, let's say, the main theme or main song, or maybe bigger part of the soundtrack. And second thing is that I cannot agree at some point with that because for me personally, it also depends when you hire someone from, let's say, outside video games world. So let's put Gustavo Santaola for an example, who composed recently for The Last of Us. This guy never did video games before. He is a film composer, but I think that the reason this music worked so well in a game was because he, as a creator, as an artist, had proper direction from development team, from audio director, from musical director, who was able to, you know, draw a vision and point the artist into the right direction.
All right. So, do you guys think that it's gonna go, like you were saying, more over the top soon? Like we're gonna see, you know, more bands being hired by video game composers, for example?
Well, I believe that anything can happen. There is no rule. It's not that you're gonna have more than this or that. It's just that what I think is you're gonna have more professionals. Because now games, you know, we're still young. If you look around, you know, it's not like in Hollywood when you have, you know, people like 70 years old and they're working on movies. You know, we're still very young. So to have more professionals will mean that we're going to have a more maturity, you know, a better maturity of what we're doing, and meaning that, you know, to hire someone that doesn't know a game and to direct him, making sure that what this person is going to get from this composer and will use that to integrate the music the best it could, you know, then yes, it's going to happen, you know. So whether it's a band, a composer, or anything. Now, if you want, you know, to go and to compare once again with Hollywood, it happens with movies. It's the same story. They are, you know, composers, bands, blah, blah, blah. But here we're specialized composers for video games, as we have movies, you know, composer, film scoring composer. Specialized, you know, as Alan Silvestri, John Williams, Hans Zimmer, they're specialized, you know, they don't do songs. So, you know, everything can happen, but I'm pretty sure here we're talking about, you know, more about our input than what could happen either way, you know, with a band or another composer from the movies.
All right. One other area I'd like to cover today is the technology, you know, because back 15 years ago, mostly all we had was this stereo sound, and like now it's 7.1 Dolby surround, and then you have, you know, higher sampling rates, higher bit resolution on samples, and for example, Oliver, your soundtrack to Remember Me is kind of famous of being constructed on those technological tricks, and there's a lot of post-production in it, right? And how do you think you would have approached making Remember Me if you were tasked to make it 15 years ago? Do you think it would be any different?
The difference is that I wouldn't be able to do it on my own, but someone like the FX Twin could have done it. It's just because the tools to produce such scores are now much easier, you know, for composers like me to produce this. The technology in games now, the fact that, you know, the more power we get, the more we can do in real time. And what's happening in games right now is that, you know, we're getting to this point where we can have the music very reacting to the action, but still it's a recording that we have and we trick everything in real time. Say that now the orchestra would be samples based, but will be played in real time by the consoles. You know, so now the brass, the strings, everything, as we do, on our computers would be directly in the game because the system, you know, the CPU and everything, the memory will be big enough. So now it means that it's like someone would play and a conductor would be following your movement, you know, in real time. And I think the technology will permit this. I'm pretty sure Peter can talk about this, you know, because he's very good with samples.
Yeah, the question was about the 15 years, yeah? The technology. Well, music progresses with the technology. It's kind of pushes it forward and uses it too. So in any case, if we are doing samples today, they just push people and their creativity forward. Just that, I think so.
So do you think that innovation in music requires the technological development to happen first?
No, I think it goes probably even the other way around. You know, historically, the music in the modern music, so-called, of the 20th century, that's really based on the possibilities, technological possibilities. You know, the electronic devices that produce sounds and stuff like this.
All right. Now, so that we all agree that the technological development is moving forward really quickly. That means technical equipment is getting cheaper, and basically, virtually anyone can have their own home studio. And don't you guys perceive it as a threat to you?
I don't think it's a threat. I wouldn't probably become game music composer if I would not be able to you know, learn and experiment in my early days with computers, samples, and stuff that I was creating at my very desk. So personally, I'm very grateful for the technological process and development, because otherwise I don't know how my professional life would end up.
So was it the same for you two guys too?
Yeah. You know, really, if not the technology, we probably wouldn't write just as good like today. And if simply someone can get those tools as we can, they are still like 15 years. We are still like 15 years ahead. And
yeah, exactly. It will be all about pen and paper, just like in the old days.
All right. I guess we could talk about it for hours and hours, but we're slowly getting to the final part, where I'd like to ask every one of you about a short, could you provide us a quick, you know, foresight into the next 15 years? What do you think, which directions do you think it's going to go? We've covered some of that already, but what do you think will be the future of video game music in general?
It starts with people, so that's the main thing. People, technology, and then philosophy. And I think the people, as I said, is getting older, more mature. So the approach with music will be different and hopefully emancipated from the movie industry, meaning that we don't relate on them anymore. The technology, of course, is going to be very helpful to get, as I said, maybe a full orchestra real time or effects in real time with the music. So the reaction between the music and the game will be very tight. And finally, the philosophy, meaning that how the approach of the composer and the collaboration with the developer will evolve. And I think composers in the future will know much more about video games that they know already now, and their input to how the music should work on the game should be as it was when, you know, John Williams was scoring Star Wars. It's like today, if you picture this, you know, today you have John Williams as the composer of Star Wars, you know, someone in between, maybe two guys, and then you have Steven Spielberg, and never John Williams saw the movie. The result is, you know, maybe good, but it's going to be way different if the composer would be directly in connection with John Williams. So this is what I think it's going to happen in the next 15 years.
Marcin?
I'm very excited to see how our development tools for video games would develop. Right now we have a nice selection of audio middlewares we can use to integrate sound and music into video games. Right now we are able to to mixing music on the fly, to have dynamic mixer states, snapshots, etc., etc. And I'm very excited to see where this will take us, how it will develop even further in next years, in the next forthcoming years.
Piotr?
John Williams, by the way, started the kind of revolution after the synthesizer music of the 70s. And with the Star Wars soundtrack, it came up like a big boom of huge number of soundtracks, one after another, recorded by an orchestra. Then somewhere, where Hans Zimmer started being really on the top, like with the Gladiator, or maybe even before Gladiator. There was this another kind of fashion born to have this synthesizer and orchestral sound together and coming up like a huge sound, unrealistic really. And I think in 50 years probably there will be some kind of breakthrough again. And I have really no idea what it will be, but I'm excited to see what it is.
All right, we still have a few minutes, so one more thing I'd like to ask you guys is, we've agreed that the budgets are getting bigger, the technology is pushing forward, and so on, but how has the attitude of game developers changed towards video game music? Because, all of you have worked with different development teams, and there are always the marketing guys, there are the developers themselves, there are the artists, and how could you relate to that? Has anything changed during the last years? Do they look at the video game music in a different way?
I can't say. What I can say is, in my experience, what happens is most of the time in games they don't know what music can be. So this is why they go and take references, like, oh, that's the reference we want, that's the reference we want. It's like they're not very, I'd say, they are interested into music, but they know that the music will never sell the game. So it's not their top priority, ever, So the good part of that means that composers like me, we have some sort of freedom, because they're not looking at you like, oh, you have to change this, B flat, because it won't sell as much as, like the mustache on the main character. I don't know. So this freedom that we have is very good. Now, how it's going to evolve is, as I said, I'm pretty sure that the connection, you could say, it's not about the music itself, it's about the games. How the games are going to be, in about already 5 years from now, with the VR, with all the tablets, of course, but also the indie games that we have that are much more emotional, sometimes maybe too much. But there is a new wave of type of experiences with games. So music should have a different input on those games.
What do you mean by too emotional?
Too emotional is just because for years, games were just about killing the zombies or saving the princess, and now it's, there are stories, there are a lot of, and I'm talking about indie games, such games as, Gone Home or Dear Esther, or I don't know if you play those games, it's very emotional, but it's all about emotions, which is good. But it doesn't make a full game. You can, it's a small game, so it's okay. But I'm talking about a big experience. Maybe games are going to be much shorter now. I don't know.
Marcin, can you tell us something from your own perspective on working on, 2 Witcher titles? Has the attitude of the developers, changed toward the music? Do you get more creative freedom, for example?
That's a really tough question.
Sorry, all right.
I think it's always nice to see that people you are working with on a video game are aware of the fact that fittable music, music that fits and serves the game, can actually lift up the whole project. So
yeah, but Oliver said that, you know, music, if it was even the best music in the world, it still couldn't sell a game by itself, right?
I know I'm repeating myself, but I think that depends on the projects, really. For example, we picked for Witcher 3 very particular musical direction, and it wouldn't probably, you know, add another 0 to sales of the game. Probably not, but I like to believe that the approach of the music we took and this idea of how the music should sound in our game, the idea we are exploring, can help game look better in the media, can, I don't know, maybe appeal players more, for example, so help create more consistent piece of art.
All right, so Piotr, can you tell us something about, you know, your personal experiences from, you know, the development team versus the composer and stuff like that?
The longest I've been with one company is still with 11-bit studios, and I feel that with each project they give me more freedom in composing, and that's a really cool thing, and I would like to thank those guys. Not sure if you are there. Nope. Yeah, that's one thing, but I kind of disagree with Olivier that good music doesn't sell games. Kind of does. You know, trailers sell games, and the music in the trailers also is part of the, you know, the product, the trailer and the product, the game itself. I think it does sell often the game itself, but also I think that there are times that the music it comes online and is being kind of advertised before the game itself, before it is released, and if the soundtrack is a success, then the game will be too. I think so.
Okay.
All right, so one last question. If you guys were tasked with creating music for a title which is strictly online oriented, you know, like an MMO game or something like that, how would your approach differ from your standard approach towards a single player oriented game? Do you think there would be anything different in particular or not? Because the experience is radically different.
Well, every experience of every game should be different, in my opinion. So you have to consider MMO differently from a narrative-driven game, but every narrative-driven game is going to be different from one to another. Let's say The Witcher 3 is way different from Assassin's Creed. So musically speaking, it's, in terms of artistic vision, it's going to be different. Now, in terms of the function of the music, how the music works with the game, once again, it depends on the developers and the composer implication. Like, how do we want the music to interact with the players? So for an MMO like World of Warcraft, you know, it's like illustration. You go in a certain zone and you have this score. You go in another zone, it's another score. It's illustration. But now they could have done something based on the level up, you know. As soon as you get level up, the music would go and grow. I don't know, maybe it's just crazy. It's a question of collaboration between the composer and the creator of the game, in my opinion.
All right, fair enough. So, do you guys want to add anything? Any last words?
To this topic, I think it also depends on the gameplay itself. For games that you can play like hours and hours and days and weeks, months and so on, then the music has to be somewhat less boring and maybe a bit characteristic, but not too pushed forward, in the face of the gamer. And how to achieve this certain balance is our secret. Just don't tell them.
All right, fair enough. I guess we're slowly running out of time, so that does it for our discussion. And we have a few minutes for a session of questions and answers. So if anyone wants to ask one of our composers a question, just raise your hand.
In late 90s and early 2000s, there was this popular format for video game music, a tracker format like impulse tracker and screen tracker, which is, for those who maybe don't know, basically a MIDI file which only uses samples and instruments that are stored as sounds in the same file. So I always found it kind of neat because it sounds good when done right. And it basically allows to change the whole track at the game's runtime. Do you think that this format, this type of format, not the same exact format obviously, do you think that this type of format has any future, or is it obsolete and has to be forgotten?
That's a very good question, and I think that the answer is that this format is still used. Take Nintendo platforms, for example. Nintendo musical development tools are using the same idea of putting together music, but in a little bit more sophisticated way. But still, these are MIDI sequences with folders of samples packed all into one file. And if I'm not mistaken, the core idea of the system is with us since Game Boy Advance platform up to today, Nintendo Wii and Nintendo Wii U, so it is still used at some points.
Yes, and what's happening with new tools, like there is this tool that you might know if you know about music, it's called Wise. It's made by Audio Kinetic, it's free, you can try it. And what you're talking about is, I was just at their headquarters in Montreal last week, and they're doing this. They're implementing into their own engine that is used, I think, in The Witcher 3.
Exactly.
MIDI files that could play samples. They created this for a game called Rocksmith for Ubisoft, and now it's going to be available for everybody during this year. It means what? It means that exactly the flexibility that we had using trackers and Nintendo, what they do, accelerating the music, changing the pitch very easily, is going to be very, affordable for people like us to do this on orchestra, because in the future, as I said, we're going to have virtual instruments directly within the game. So the MIDI file will play the virtual instruments, and now it's going to be all in real time.
Thank you.
Hi. So the first thing I'd like to say is that I'm the kind of gamer who really appreciates music in the games. So thank you guys for doing what you're doing, because you're doing a great job. And for some of us, it's a very important part of the whole experience. But I've got a couple of questions, but I guess I'll just ask one and see how it goes later on. What would you say, like, what was the strangest kind of sound or the strange kind of instrument that you ever used in your soundtracks? Was there anything like specific, or did you use some very weird method of getting a sound that you needed, or something like that? Do you recall anything like that?
Do you know this?
Yeah.
So...
do you mean remixing, or is it...
Remember Me is, we went to London, so try to picture this. We went to London to record one of the best orchestra with the sound engineer from Lord of the Rings. We had the best recording ever, for this orchestra. Wonderful London Philharmonic. And I went back home, and what I did is I processed this orchestra into electronic effects. So, the guys would be like, and then back home it would be like, like this. So that was completely crazy and risky. But in the end, it paid off. A lot of people got a good attention on the soundtrack. So that's my experience.
It is a very good soundtrack. Marcin?
I don't know if that's a weird or crazy usage of instrument, but recently, during a session for Witcher 3, we did record electric cello, which is an instrument without a resonance box. We recorded that as a completely acoustic instrument. So the outcome of that was this raw, actually very deep. I was very surprised how deep an instrument can sound without a resonance box. So we did achieve a sound which has lots of sand in it, as I like to call that. And I'm actually pretty excited with using that.
There was one time I used, this was for a short video that was kind of all in slow motion, very, very slow motion. And I used, as an instrument, I used my own previous compositions, stretched over like 1,000 times, and on top of that, just regular arrangement.
All right, do we have any more questions?
What about indie developers? Is it possible to have a decent music when you're low on budget? What would be the approach to a music for an indie developer?
Yeah, when you don't have budget and you want great music, this is your question?
Not necessarily great, but decent.
No, great. You want great. You don't want decent. You want your game to be decent?
I simply do not have a budget for a great music, so that's why I'm asking for decent. But if you know a way to have a great music with low budget, then...
Well, you know what? The first Mario Brother game, the very first game, you know, it was just blip blip and just a melody with 2 notes, you know, and it was a great score, great music. So you don't need budget to obtain this. It's a great composer that you had. So my advice is don't try to mimic Hollywood. Don't try to get what they do because it's going to sound, you know, cheap and bad. But try to get something that within your creativity will sound great. You know, this is what I just did with a game that came out today called Bound by Flame. It's a action RPG, dark fantasy world. And they were like, oh, we need an orchestra for this. And I said, okay, do you have the money for it? No. Okay, so do you want to go samples? And I said, no. And so we went to do electronic, atmospheric, you know, drones and things. And you know, in the end, it paid off. So you have to be creative, in my opinion.
All right, thank you so much, guys, for accepting our invitation and coming here and discussing. Many thanks to the audience for coming here and asking questions. So once again, that's all from our side, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.